So a few weeks ago, I was in Salt Lake City and I watched this debate between Kwaku L and Aaron Shafovaloff. It was a debate about whether Jesus is enough. And so this was a debate I was pretty excited about. I was hoping that it would be kind of this clash of the titans between Protestant theology and LDS theology. But ultimately, it really wasn't. It probably didn't have quite as climactic results as I was hoping. And didn't really go the way that I expected. But I still want to break this down a little bit and just talk to you guys about what I thought. So first I want to start with just kind of my first off thoughts about it. The topic for this debate was, is Jesus enough? They went into kind of three different rounds basically with it. Is salvation by faith alone? Has there been a great apostasy? And are families forever? And this was the basic premise of the whole thing. Kwaku L was the LDS YouTuber that was a part of it. And he's been a part of Saints Unscripted, also known as Three Mormons, and now he's kind of started his own channel. He's pretty well known and liked within the LDS faith, and I think especially with this Gen Z population and with millennials, he's really well liked just for his demeanor and the way that he speaks. Aaron he's actually a researcher for the Mormon Research Institute, and he's an elder at Mission Church. And so I was excited for this debate. I've talked with Kwaku quite a few times myself, just dialoguing on some of his online content. And he's just a really likable guy. I like him a lot. Although when I met him, I got a chance to meet him earlier in that week before we went to the debate. He was a little smaller than I imagined.
Thank you. Him, that can't be William Wallace. I'm prettier than this man.
Aaron was also just really passionate, and I was excited to see him get into it because I think he just knows the scriptures really well, and it's just so abundantly clear that he wants people to know and to love Christ. And so I was excited about this debate. I thought it was just going to be really cool to see them get into this, and I was really rooting for Aaron, of course, hoping that I would see him really be able to put Kwaku in his place. But ultimately, if I'm honest, I don't think Aaron won this debate. I think ultimately Kwaku came across a lot more likable. I think he had a way about him. I think Kwaku was winsome. I think he had more charisma, and he used rhetoric really, really well in this debate to make his points. And so overall, I think that allowed him to win the crowd. I don't think necessarily that his arguments were better. There was some places that I think he did have better arguments, but overall, I don't think it's because his arguments were better. I think it was because he won the crowd. And in a debate, you just have to realize, even if you do have the better argument, it doesn't necessarily mean that you won with the crowd. And ultimately, the point of the debate is more to win the crowd than it is to win by logic. Aaron, on the other hand, was passionate, but probably to a fault. I think at some points, his emotion came across as not being confident or maybe not having as much to say. And because Kwaku remained calm, I think that allowed him to come across as, I know what I have to say. I know that I have this guy against the ropes. I don't have to fight as hard. It's kind of that Muhammad Ali type, I'm just dodging the punches.
You can't touch this.
And it doesn't have to worry about giving the big punches himself because he knows he's got the thing in the bag. And that just tone itself allowed Kwaku, I think, to just come across as the winner in the debate. So, breaking down the rounds. First round was salvation.
Round one, fight!
His salvation by faith alone. Aaron did a great job in this, presenting the gospel message as Jesus standing in proxy for us, as if he gets this temple recommend, to kind of put it in LDS terms. Jesus has this temple recommend that because of that, he gives us his temple recommend that we may be in the presence of the Lord. And I thought that was a fantastic way to just explain it to LDS believers. And then Kwaku kind of came back already in this as Aaron is coming across very emotional in this. He gives his first little kind of counterpunch to what Aaron is saying using that emotion and kind of using it as a weight against Aaron, to kind of say, wow, you're coming across super emotional here, and this is a debate, and we should be using logic and reason. And because of that, again, he's starting to win the crowd with that. Then Kwaku used his first kind of like rhetorical attack that I think rhetorically was really good. In a debate class, he would have been trounced for it. But in this, where it's not as formal in a sense, what he did is he attacked Calvinism, because Pastor Aaron is Calvinist. And so he attacked the Calvinism that Aaron believed in and came across as making Aaron look especially immoral.
You're a monster.
Because of his belief in Calvinism. Because ultimately what Kwaku did was he allowed it to look as if you accept Calvinism, if you accept everything is predestined, then how can we view your God as being just? He's predestining all of these evil acts and these evil things. That's a horrible, horrendous God, and how would anybody ultimately want that? And so what's ironic about that, Kwaku presents this, and he does it in a way that he's not being emotional presenting it, but ironically, his entire argument is emotional. Because Calvinism could be true, and ultimately, yeah, we might look at it and say, it seems like God's maybe immoral in this way, but if that's just how it is, then that's the truth. And so even if we don't like it, we can't choose things just based upon whether we like it or not. We choose things based on whether it lines up with reality or not. And so, first of all, his argument doesn't work in that sense, but even from more of a debate sense, Kwaku's goal, what he should have been doing through the whole debate was disproving the Christian or the evangelical worldview as being more legit.
Too legit. I was too legit to quit.
Compared to the LDS view. But he didn't do that when he attacked Calvinism in this whole round. All he did there was accomplish showing that a evangelical Calvinist view wasn't as good as an LDS view. But now he still has to deal with all of those who still believe in free will that are evangelical. Now, this was something that I've talked with Kwaku about afterwards, and I come to understand that Kwaku just sees if you're evangelical, he ultimately believes that it breaks down into you have to be Calvinist. And the way he sees that is because ultimately God is omniscient, and he doesn't necessarily believe God is omniscient. Kwaku is actually what we call an open theist, meaning he knows that we have to have free will, and the only way he sees that that's really possible is that God allows us, or he gives us that free will so that he limits his knowledge, or he doesn't have knowledge of the things that we will choose in the future. And that's what open theism is. It rejects God's omniscience in that sense. And so that's the problem that he ends up bringing in that. He doesn't see a problem with that because ultimately the God of the LDS faith is not the same as the evangelical faith. Our God is omniscient. He sees all things. And this can be reconciled. This is where Kwaku, I think, underestimates the possibilities. And I think a lot of Christians do, that they see it as either we have free will or we're predestined, and that's the only options. But ultimately, what we actually know is there's these middle grounds to make it a little bit, it's more complicated than just you have free will or you don't. There's Thomism that would actually believe that God just knows the future, but that doesn't inflict on God allowing you to have free will. Molinism that also believes in a version of that as well. And these are much more developed and intricate theologies. And I think Kwaku maybe just isn't familiar with them. And I've thrown this idea out to him. And so myself, Tim Stratton, who actually did his PhD in Molinism and showing the evidence of that theologically speaking, may end up doing a video, all three of us together. So maybe check out that, hopefully in the future. If not, I'm hoping he'll at least connect with Tim Stratton because he knows a lot more about it than I do. But this is something that I think ultimately undermines so much of what Kwaku ended up doing in this debate, is he just attacked Calvinism itself, but all he's done now is just put Calvinism to the side, and his goal was bigger than that. He had to show that the evangelical faith doesn't add up as well to the LDS faith, and all he's done is put Calvinism to the side. So in the question round of that, Aaron came across again a bit as an emotional, and he kind of machine gunned Kwaku with a lot of questions.
Say hello to my little friend.
Where he was trying to get through as many questions as he could. And I think Aaron thought that this worked really well, but I think ultimately what that ended up doing is, even in the points that the crowd saw, oh, you've painted Kwaku maybe into a little bit of a corner here, or you've shown something that doesn't fit quite right with Kwaku's view, he moved so quickly to the next point that I think by the time he was done with his questions, the crowd didn't really know what happened anymore. They didn't have something to take away as, wow, this is the one thing that I saw that Kwaku couldn't answer well. And so he should have focused in on one thing. He started to kind of focus in on, well, is Jesus enough alone to give the fullest exaltation in the LDS view of heaven, the highest level of heaven? And we honed in on this a little bit. That's where Kwaku, I think, felt himself a little bit painted into a corner, because to get to that highest kingdom, ultimately, you have to get married and you have to follow those temple ordinances. And so Jesus alone isn't enough to reach those places, though he is enough to get salvation, but they define salvation differently. Salvation is just getting to the heavenly realms. But to get to the highest heavenly realms, to then become a God yourself, which is part of the LDS theology, you need to do these other things. And Jesus isn't enough to get you there, which was part of the whole debate. Is Jesus enough, period? Is he enough for salvation? And in the way we define it as evangelicals, he's not really enough by the LDS view, because you can't get there. You can't get all the way up without doing these other things. And so I think he needed to focus on that. Again, Kwaku then focused in on Calvinism and basically tried to paint Aaron as this moral monster in that. Round 2.
Round 2, fight!
The great apostasy. So Kwaku again kind of uses a bit of an emotional appeal here. And this is, again, it's an interesting pattern that we saw in the debate, is even though Kwaku comes across calm and put together, his arguments themselves were appeals to emotion. And so when we go into, was there actually a great apostasy, Kwaku gives all these anecdotes, all of these examples of reformers or theologians or other leaders of the evangelical church that ultimately we would look at and say they were wrong for some of the things that they said and some of the things that they did, or the Catholic Church as well. And so because of that, what Kwaku is saying is, see how horrible they were? The whole church must have been apostate. Because ultimately, if you have a full apostasy, which is what you need in order for the church to be apostate and not just need reformation, then you have to show that the whole church has gone that way, not that simply some of its leaders have. And so this ends up being an appeal to emotion, because he's bringing out all of these horrendous things and horrible things, I'll totally agree, some of the evangelical leaders said or did. But that doesn't ultimately mean that the church itself has gone fully apostate. That just means that some of the people have gone wrong. Aaron countered, I think, with a really good analogy, and a really good biblical analogy at that, where he referenced the tale of the weeds growing in the fields. And when the harvest is brought up, Jesus doesn't say that they should gather the harvest and then let the weeds grow up and then burn all the weeds. It says, let the weeds grow with the harvest and then gather them together and separate them and burn the weeds. And that seems to imply by the time Jesus comes back, there will be the weeds among it, but there will still be a harvest. So there hasn't been an apostasy. So biblically speaking, even though Kwaku gave these other examples from scripture of ways that we saw even by the time the apostles are still writing the New Testament, that the church is starting to go off the track a little bit, the Bible itself seems to proclaim that it's not going to go so far off that it needs a full restoration. I asked Kwaku afterwards during the follow-up questions, ultimately, what I see is that you're bringing up these anecdotes. What do you have to say about the fact that the LDS Church says that John didn't actually die and that he actually remains on earth till this day proclaiming the gospel? Or that's what he asked, and why he's still around is he wanted to keep proclaiming the gospel. Kwaku's reply to this was that ultimately the apostasy isn't something that's rooted in the fact that the church itself has fully gone apostate, but that the keys of the priesthood have been removed. The problem with this that I see is ultimately, well, you still have John, that by the Mormon view has never left the earth. And of course, he had the keys to the priesthood. So if the keys don't exist anymore, it's not just a failure of the apostles not passing along that priesthood, which the Mormons want to say that since the renewal of the priesthood, it's been regularly passed down. And the reason that it was lost is it wasn't regularly passed down. You still have the problem of John, because John has the keys and he never left the earth. And so the question becomes, did God actually just remove that priesthood from John, which seems like a really odd thing to do? Plus, it seems like that would also make him morally culpable for why the church did go full apostate, because John could have restored it. Well, not really restored it. He could have kept it going correctly had God not removed the keys from him. And so the fact that we have all of these apostles later, or I shouldn't say apostles, these evangelical leaders later that don't have the priesthood and are ultimately proclaiming and doing these horrible things, the only reason that's happening is because God removed the priesthood from them, which in turn seems to make God once again morally culpable, which really ends up being the same problem that Kwaku is giving against Calvinism in the first place. And so the same thing that he is looking at it and saying Calvinism is horrible because of this, the same thing must be true if the church went apostate in the Mormon view. Another thing that I think should be brought up here when we're talking about apostasy is, how do you know as a Mormon that the church hasn't gone apostate now? Sure, it may have been restored with Joseph Smith, but how do you know it hasn't gone apostate since? Some Mormons, and this is an interesting thing, would proclaim that the apostasy happened immediately after the death of the other apostles, everyone but John, of course. So they didn't pass on the keys to the priesthood and the church went apostate immediately after. There's really no declaration of exactly when it happened, but that's one possibility of when it happened. So when we look at that, there's some things that we can look at with the LDS Church of some pretty horrible things that the leaders, even the presidents, have said and done in the LDS Church in just the 200 years since Joseph Smith. So why hasn't it gone apostate as well? It just as well could have gone apostate. And when we realize that the LDS Church has only been around for a tenth the time of the Christian church, well, I would say if we went that bad in that long of a time, you guys are well on your way to getting that bad in a much shorter time than us.
Round 3, fight!
So round three was about eternal marriage. Does marriage continue on after eternity, or does it end before we enter into eternity? And this was the one round that I think Aaron handily won, because ultimately this was more asking, does marriage continue on because it's a need and Jesus isn't enough in himself in that? And Aaron, I think, proved this extremely well, again, in his typical style of getting very passionate and excited about it and yelling into it. But his points were clear to point out that ultimately the LDS faith, if it's true, is saying that you're not ultimately have everything that you need. You don't ultimately have everything that you need. Everything is not sufficient enough by Christ alone. That in the LDS view, you need marriage. That only through that will you be totally fulfilled. And Aaron went on even more so to explain how in the Christian worldview, we look at it and we understand that we have an eternal family, greater and more than we could ever imagine beyond the family that we have here. Where in the LDS view, you're looking at it and you're saying, I want this family that I have now, and life won't be enough. Heaven won't be heaven without my family now. And that view is totally rooted in this idea that ultimately Jesus isn't enough. That in the Christian worldview, though, Jesus is enough. That alone, if I have fellowship with Jesus and there's nothing else, that's enough. But we're given a promise beyond that, that we're going to have a family beyond and greater than anything that an LDS faith can ever provide. And so it's going to be a greater family. And in a sense, it's going to be a bigger family because really, in the LDS theology, the only way that you're going to be totally in fellowship with your family is if they also are LDS, if they also go through the temple ordinances, if they've also been celestially sealed. All of these things are requirements in order to be in fellowship with your family totally and fully. And those things will only happen if those things come together. Where in the Christian worldview, in the real true Christian worldview that says you are saved by grace, not by your works, simply accepting Christ, that those of your family who accept Christ, you will be in fellowship with them, and you will have that same level of fellowship in an intimate family, even with those who aren't even your family when you get to eternity. And so in that sense, it ends up being so much greater than anything the Mormon faith can ever provide. And I think Aaron did a phenomenal job pointing this fact out. This was where I think also Kwaku made the biggest mistake that he made in this whole debate. And in this, one of the things that he said is that when Aaron asked him about polygamy and whether or not polygamy was okay, Kwaku's response in this was to say it was okay because it was something God ordained. Or in his words, it was something that it was okay because God decreed it, is the way Kwaku put it. But this, what he doesn't realize, by saying that God decreed it, he undermined his entire argument.
Do you realize what you've done?
By saying this, what he was ultimately saying is that those moral things, even all the things that he had been talking about with Calvinism, were ultimately acceptable or could be acceptable just because God decreed it. So his entire argument that really had been the crux of everything he'd been saying in the debate to this point was completely undermined by him saying that polygamy was okay simply because God decreed it. Because the Calvinists can then turn around and simply say, well, those things are okay because God decreed it. And so Kwaku, I don't think he realized the mistake that he made in that. But ultimately, if we're saying that something's okay just because God decreed it, then Calvinism has no problem, morally speaking, because those are things that God decreed, because he predestined them. So this was my overall view of the debate. I hope that helps you kind of break it down a little bit. Hey, if you believe in free will and you like this video, I'd ask you to give it a like and a subscribe. If you're a Calvinist and you believe that we're predestined in everything, then you're predestined to like and subscribe. So I don't really need to say anything more to you.